Hello and welcome to another episode of This Week in Global Development, where we talk about all the big headlines happening in the global development community. I'm Raj Kumar, I'm the president and editor in chief here at Devex. And as those of you who are watching along on YouTube can tell, I'm actually at the IMF where the World Bank meetings haven't quite yet kicked off, but they're getting ready. It was just at a curtain raiser speech given by Kristalina Georgieva, the managing director here. And I'm joined today by two Devex colleagues who are going to be covering the annual meetings of the World Bank and the IMF next week. Michael Igoe is with us, Adva Saldinger. Hey, Michael, good to see you.
Hey, Raj, good to see you too.
Good to see you, Adva, as well. So let's just dive in because this is, the annual meetings week has always been an important moment. It's normally held in Washington, D.C., some years ago, overseas, but it seems like it's more important than ever. And to me, some of that's just the macro environment where, the politics around bilateral aid have gotten harder. So countries reduce their foreign assistance through bilateral mechanisms. And so the multilateral institutions are just where all the eyes are turning and they're much more in the driver's seat. Part of it's the leadership. Kristalina Georgieva at the IMF, traditional development, a humanitarian person. So the IMF has become much more relevant in our space. And of course, Ajay Banga taking over this big role at the World Bank to reform it and evolve it. So partly it's that, but I don't know. You tell me, do the two of you feel like the annual meetings are in a different moment than they were, I don't know, 5, 10 years ago?
I'll jump in first. I think you've framed it well. There's sort of this collision of the internal and the external in a way that seems heightened this year. The World Bank and the IMF are in this position of watching the world and finding practical responses to the great crises that are sort of seizing all of our attention. And then at the same time, they have to figure out is to do that effectively in terms of the nuts and bolts of their institution. So there's this sort of question of constant evolution, which I think is really heightened this year, and made even more fraught by just the scale and scope of crises bearing down on the institutions and a real sort of sense of concern, maybe even crisis about where problem solve as crises takes place. And I think you're right to say that increasingly the eyes are on these institutions to come up with solutions. The question is, can they? And so these leaders that you mentioned just seem to be under an incredible amount of pressure, all made that much more uncertain by the fact that we're in this period of intense political uncertainty and transition in the country that's hosting these meetings. So I agree. It seems like there's a lot at stake this year, and I think that means that messaging will be really important, that communication will be really important, and I expect a lot of these halls will be crowded and full of speculation.
This hall behind me was crowded until minutes ago, and in fact, in front of that crowd, I asked a question to Kristalina Georgieva about the state of the world and all of the fragile and conflict affected states that are out there. And in years past, the IMF really wasn't seen as a highly relevant institution for those countries. And it's very different now. And she has a very robust view about this. And she wants to elevate countries that, like Sudan, that are facing real conflict, but are not really in the headlines globally. And I think you're right that the IMF and the World Bank right now, in a moment when the world feels like it's spinning a little bit out of control, this is sort of an anchor point to come and say, well, what are all of the finance ministers and development ministers who are coming together this week? What are they going to do? What is that narrative that's going to come out of a week like this? And at least here, Kristalina Georgieva tried to suggest a note of some optimism or at least pragmatic potential. Her line is, "We can do better." That's kind of her theme for the annual meetings. So we're going to be hearing a lot about that. What do you think about it? You've been covering these annual meetings for years. Doesn't it feel different now?
Yeah, I guess one of the things I would just say is that one of the things that struck me that Kristalina said this morning is she said, leave your conflicts at home. Come here ready to sort of get things done. And I thought that was just kind of striking. I don't know that will happen. I think that might be a little bit wishful thinking to believe that the world's problems aren't going to be a key part of these conversations. I mean, I do think that that these meetings take on greater importance. But the one caveat I'll add is that in conversations I've had with people leading up to these meetings, they actually think that there will be sort of fewer major announcements than we've seen at the spring meetings earlier this year or at Marrakesh last year. So while there is a lot of attention on these institutions, I think there's sort of this sense that these annual meetings, partly because of the factors that Michael was mentioning, sort of where things stand and the US election and all these factors, might have a little less that sort of comes out of it. And I think for a lot of discussions, there's sort of a really key sort of stopping point on big issues. We're only a few weeks out from COP, where we have to determine a new sort of climate finance target. So that will be a discussion, but maybe not with outcomes at the annual meetings, but just a really key moment before COP to further conversations. It's obviously a really key moment ahead of an IDA replenishment that the World Bank is championing, but also questions about whether we'll see sort of any specific IDA pledges. So I think that yes, these institutions are sort of under the microscope and being expected to do more and step up. But there is a question of whether that momentum continues after these meetings. So there's a sense of, well, maybe we need to really seize the moment to get things done, because depending what happens elsewhere in the world, maybe we won't have that opportunity in the future. But also, could you risk putting the institution in a difficult position if you get out in front ahead on some
ahead of an election and ahead of where policy changes might come? I mean, one thing I was struck by, because we were all at the UN General Assembly just a couple of weeks ago, was how much talk at the UN General Assembly was about the World Bank and the MDBs. And in fact, they had that summit for the future that the Secretary General led, and a pact for the future came out of it. And one of the elements was this idea of collaboration, the UN really seeing the MDBs as part of the UN system and wanting to have a stronger voice in development finance. And I think part of the reason is exactly what we're all saying, is that this is where the action is, where the resources are. And in a moment when UN agencies, depending on the election result, might face significant cuts, the MDBs, they have paid-in capital. Even if IDA doesn't go the way that Ajay Banga wants it to go, these institutions will still have some firepower that others don't. But you both brought up the elections. Maybe we start there. Like, what is, Michael, like, when you're thinking about the elections, where do you think their influence is going to be this week? Is it just sort of hanging over every conversation? What are you listening for when it comes to the U.S. presidential elections and the World Bank IMF annual meetings?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's going to be concentrated among the speechwriters who are going to choose their words really carefully, right? Because nobody knows what's going to happen on November 5th, or even if we'll know what happened on November 5th. So yeah, I do think there's a lot of caution in the air when it comes to, what folks like Ajay Banga are going to say. And we've seen that already. He's been out there this week and fielded questions about what the election will mean for the World Bank. And, that question is usually framed in some sort of form like, if former President Trump is elected and returns to the White House, can the World Bank survive? There's sort of a fatalistic version of that question, which he really pushes back on. He says, that during Trump's administration, the bank got a capital increase, that the sort of reality doesn't necessarily match the perception that a lot of people have. And even going as far back as like Trump's first inauguration, Bongo was sort of putting some real, muted messages out there about concerns, before he was even at the bank, when he was sort of reflecting on, India being able to do business with the United States under Trump, and he had sort of a more optimistic view of that. So I think he's always been, cautious in that regard. And yet, some of the policy proposals that are out there, like the now notorious, Project 2025, I mean, these call for the United States to withdraw from the World Bank and the IMF. Now, we have no idea what that actually means, or if it means anything. But it's hard to not come away with some impression that at least the Overton window, right, like the realm of possibility here, has shifted pretty significantly. And I think that just it changes what leaders at these institutions and people who work there, it changes the reality that they have to sort of account for when they're, scenario planning.
And I think one thing we can have some confidence in, and I wouldn't have too much because, as you say, there's so much uncertainty here, but is the idea that a Trump administration would be highly transactional as opposed to relying on precedent and saying, well, this is how we've always done it. We learned this in the first term of the president. There was a sense of, look, I don't care how things were done before. I want to negotiate. I want to move and pivot to what I want to do and make deals and transact. And so if that's the case, and if that window has opened to what's possible, you're going to need to see somebody like Ajay Banga, the presidency of the World Bank, be ready to deal with the Trump administration and to make a deal based on what the different set of terms and objectives that then might have obtained in a different administration.
Yeah, transactional, interest-driven, and personality-driven. I mean, one of the great partners of the World Bank during the Trump administration was Ivanka Trump, so it depends on who's in these positions. And I think that's a conclusion that folks are drawing across the board. And that's just so hard to predict at this point.
I wanted to just jump in with one thing quickly, because while Ajay Banga talked about the capital increase for IBRD, one of the things that we actually saw when Trump came into office is that he reduced the money going to IDA. So there had been an IDA pledge by the previous administration that had been made before he came into office. Once he came into office, the number for IDA actually got reduced. So I think Ajay Banga is probably pretty carefully picking which sort of statistics he's talking about. But I do think
and that may be what we see in terms of timing, Adva. Sorry to interrupt, but just in terms of timing, isn't that what we may see this time too? A pledge from this Biden administration, and then whichever administration comes in, what will actually be the administration that delivers or doesn't on that pledge.
Yeah. So the IDA pledge will happen December 4th and 5th. So it will be the Biden administration putting forward a number. I think you could probably expect that if Kamala Harris wins the election, that number would probably stay fairly the same. But if Trump wins, I think there's a real question about whether that pledge would be fulfilled and to what extent. And the only other thing I wanted to add is just that the presidency obviously is really important, but Congress will also be sort of important in what the makeup of Congress is. And, we did see some attempt sort of in the budget put forward by House Republicans this year to reduce funding to multilateral development banks. And so I think that's also sort of a sign. Maybe the U.S. doesn't withdraw altogether, but does funding come down in some significant manner? So I think that's another piece of this to watch.
Yeah, I've had some Republican sources tell me, back to this idea of transactional deal-making approaches to policy, that they don't think a Trump administration would take away the tools of the presidency on their own. And so if you see the MDB system as kind of a tool of the U.S. presidency, that the U.S. is the largest shareholder in the World Bank, it's a major or largest in many other regionals, that why give up that position of power for nothing? And so that at least for some Republicans I've spoken to who are, in this space, feel like we're unlikely to see the most extreme end of that spectrum and what's mentioned in Project 2025. You're going to be talking, Michael, to some of the Project 2025 backers or authors at Devex World next week, which comes right in the middle of these annual meetings. And it'll be interesting to hear how they frame some of these issues. And of course, there's a big controversy to what degree is this aligned with what President Trump might do in the future. But it's a fascinating conversation to have.
Yeah, and I think the point that you just made, that there's no benefit to stepping away from these institutions, rings true, except that we did see the Trump administration step away from the table in some cases with World Health Organization and the Paris Agreement, the climate agreement. So maybe I think it depends on how the politics shake out, at the particular moment when those decisions have to be made, and sort of, how a Trump administration regards multilateralism at that point. Is this something that they want to be involved in?
Right. And the most politically fragile institutions, as you say, like UNESCO, UNFPA, the WHO, like there are certain institutions where there's real political benefit to pulling out the U.S. in dramatic fashion. And whereas others, there may be less of that political benefit, but we don't know. We'll have to see how the politics shakes out there. About what are some of the other stories that you're looking to cover during the annual meeting week?
Yeah, so obviously I've mentioned the IDA replenishment. IDA is the World Bank's fund for the poorest countries. That's going to be a really key conversation at these meetings. There are a lot of headwinds to getting to the sort of $100 billion target that Banga put out there, or even, the higher $120 billion target that a lot of IDA recipient countries are calling for. And one of those real issues is that a lot of countries that are big IDA donors are facing really significant domestic challenges to their development budgets. And they're also facing currency challenges. The value of their currency is a lot weaker against the dollar. So, for example, in a place like Japan, I think they have to increase their IDA contribution by at least 25% to just match where they were last time because of the devaluation of their currency. So, a lot of headwinds. We've seen some insights into sort of how the World Bank might look at where that money is going to go. There's some conversations about how do you increase rates. The real tension I'm hearing about is between the size of IDA and its concessionality. So, will it have to charge higher rates because that allows it to leverage more of the donor capital and at the expense of fewer grants, even though a lot of IDA countries are facing great debt distress. And so we really need those grant dollars. Also looking at debt, I think the framing from the World Bank and the IMF is increasingly around a lot of the debt issues being less about solvency than about liquidity. So we may see some sort of proposals moving forward at the IMF or G20 level, looking at how to address some of the liquidity issues, which folks have sort of mixed opinions about. Some people think it's a good step, but are you just sort of prolonging the challenge? And so your countries will borrow additional money now, but you're just going to face a solvency crisis down the road. So that's a couple of the things. We have seen some announcements from the World Bank actually this week that I wanted to mention. One of those on their sort of capital adequacy reforms is they said that they were going to further reduce their equity to loan ratio from 19% to 18%. It's not as much as some people had hoped. People were hoping they would go down to 17%. But essentially, that will unlock about $30 billion additional dollars over 10 years that the bank can lend. This morning at the press conference with Ajay Banga, I actually asked him, because if you look at the numbers in the equity to loan ratio for last year, the bank actually was still at about 21.5%. So even though
they were allowed,
they have said that they can come down, but they're actually not lending that additional capital yet. And so I asked him about it, and he said, look, it takes time. Our projects take a lot of time. They are trying to speed up how quickly money can get out the door, but I think they've brought it down from an average of 19 months to 16 months. So it seems like it's partly, needing to get more projects on the books and get projects out the door. So we saw a couple other sort of proposals around how the bank can sort of do more with the capital it has. And we saw today the release of the sort of full version of the new corporate scorecard, which is a set of 22 indicators that the bank's going to use to sort of set and measure its progress. So I think there'll be some interesting space to dig into some of those indicators and really see where the bank stands on some of their key commitments. Another big issue is going to be gender. There's a day dedicated to gender. The bank has a new gender strategy. I'm going to be speaking actually for a special edition of the podcast with the head of gender at the bank to get some insights into that new gender policy and what we might see sort of gender day at the meetings.
Yeah, fantastic. And I think you've outlined one of the big themes that everybody's going to be paying attention to during these annual meetings, which is around the reform of the World Bank and whether the Ajay Banga presidency, which came with a lot of fanfare, is it working? Is he able to achieve this reform? And he said right from the start, this takes time, expectations are way too high. But, I'm hearing mixed feelings from people, including people who work inside the bank, about the reforms. And I think this will be one of the key questions that we'll get to hear Ajay Banga and others address. In fact, Axel von Trotzenberg, I'm going to be interviewing him. He's the World Bank Senior Managing Director. He's been there forever, and he's been a leader on this current evolution roadmap. And he'll be at Devex World helping us to kick off the event. And I think there's a big question mark about how are these reforms going? What can we expect? Exactly to your point, Adva, about this sort of sweating the balance sheet, like big announcement, we're going to reduce the equity ratio required, but then can we even achieve it in a time scale that matters to the world, because the bank has to go through its traditional processes. So it is a tall order to reform that institution. And I think we might get some more insight this week into how it's going.
I'll just note that I feel like you're hitting on something that comes up a lot with the World Bank, and particularly under this presidency, which is like the reforms that have to happen before you can do the reforms that maybe you have to do before you want to do the next reform. It's like this series of things, and I feel like Ajay Banga in particular is sort of finding himself, at the he sort of like opens a door and it leads to another door and another. It's just like all of these nuts and bolts, and you mentioned the effort to make things more efficient. Adva, I feel like that's sort of been step one for him, is how do you just make this institution get things done more quickly? And then once it starts to get things done more quickly, can you start to do bigger things? And maybe that happens a little more quickly. So I don't know. I do. It does sort of feel like we've been seeing this effort to kind of chip away at all of the barriers for a long time. And it seems that the question is like, eventually, is that whole sort of wall that prevents like sort of major large scale reforms going to fall down, and suddenly we have a new institution that operates the way that everybody wants it to. I don't know. That's probably a magical moment that is unreasonable to expect.
It feels maybe to people on the outside who don't know the institution well and are looking at the climate crisis and rising conflict, debt crises, it feels quite dissatisfying to hear, well, the World Bank has launched a new corporate scorecard. Really? Like that's the innovation. But I think if you listen to Ajay Bug, he's pretty compelling about the idea that as a former, corporate executive himself, you got to start with the basic plumbing of the institution. And if you don't have those things working right, you'll never get to the big things. But I do think this week we'll get a sense of how is that going? What's the narrative around it? How much patience is there in the world, especially given the political winds that are blowing against a lot of what the bank is trying to do? The other thing I'm interested in is, of course, the competition for dollars in this shrinking, foreign aid environment. You've got the global health vertical funds that are out there looking for funding. You've got multiple MDBs out there looking for their concessional funds to grow, and IDA, of course. So like that conversation, does it descend into more of a competitive dynamic? Does it stay, as I think it's so far been, largely a friendly, everyone has a role to play kind of narrative? That's something else I'll be listening out for.
Yeah, 100%. I think, IDA is certainly kind of a moment to take stock of which direction things are going, which of those two paths that you described we're on. The Center for Global Development has just come out with some really interesting stuff on, what they're calling the traffic jam of replenishments. And we do just have this real pile up of huge and hugely important funds that all are asking their donors for money at the same time. One thing
the U.S. plays such an outsized role in all of those funds. In some of them, like the Global Fund, the U.S. plays a matching role function. But in so many of these, the U.S. presidential election is a really big question mark across how those fundraisings will actually end up going.
Yeah, we all sound kind of election obsessed, but it actually, like, there's a reason, which is that these funds are watching that really closely. One thing that was interesting in the Center for Global Development research is that what they've shown is that even as sort of donor belts have been tightening, the number of funds has been proliferating. And so the question that you posed, are these all going to be in competition with each other, or can they exist in sort of a, the argument is like, maybe more funds bring in more donors, but maybe they don't, and I think there are a lot of open questions about how this funding landscape shakes out.
Yeah, I just wanted to add one thing. And I think, you talked about like, are we election obsessed? And so I do think it's like hanging over these meetings. But I think what the bank leadership and probably what IMF leadership is going to try to do is really be focused on like what they can do, right? Like that's what Ajay Banga said this morning. He like, there are all these other things at play, but there are things the bank can do. And so I think to that end, it's like, well, what are we going to see the bank sort of put forward? He talked about he's going to put forward his vision for sort of the next chapter of this roadmap and reform on Friday at the bank meetings. And so I think that will be a key moment to sort of look out for. And I think the bank we will probably see some sort of announcement on agriculture. That's going to be a big focus one of the days. And in some cases, actually, if you look at the corporate scorecard, they're not like hitting the targets of where they thought they would be on some of the food security targets. So I think that's something that some of our colleagues will be exploring next week. And then there's this big piece that we haven't really talked about, which is about sort of private sector. One of the things that Ajay Banga said he really wanted to do coming in is mobilize more private capital through what the World Bank does. They've reorganized their sort of guarantee program. And I'm going to have some conversations with folks next week about sort of what that means, how far they've actually come, whether those reforms have happened, whether that's actually meaning that more private sector is engaged. We've seen some things at, IFC about sort of securitization platforms. But I think, again, also questions on like, how much of this is just discussion of things that could happen or that they want to happen versus is it actually happening? And so I think those are some of the sort of critical pieces to look at next week. And also the Private Sector Innovation Lab will meet. Are they going to come out with any significant proposals? We haven't seen a ton of sort of concrete action out of that group. So I know that one of their main work streams is sort of on currency risk. So is there a bigger role for the bank to play in that? What recommendations they might have around that? So I think there are some things to watch for, but we'll see where some of the things shake out on that. I did also want to mention that, I think part of the challenge is how the bank looks at and measures private capital mobilization. And so there's been a big effort by the group Publish What You Fund to come up with sort of a new mechanism for how one measures private capital mobilization. And that's, I think, was like maybe officially released yesterday, but going to be discussed at the meetings next week as well. Something that I'll be looking at.
Yeah, great points. And I agree, the plumbing that Ajay Banga is trying to fix, really what the end goal of a lot of that is to bring in private sector money. It's about speeding up the process, originating more, and then being able to distribute these deals and bring in private sector investment. And if you can't get those first things done, then you can't get the private sector money to flow. But ultimately, the way I think the world is going to score his presidency is exactly by what Publish What You Fund is putting out. How many new dollars have been crowded in against development objectives in low and middle income countries. We know the money's out there. It's sitting on the sidelines in pension funds, in hedge funds, and private equity funds, and all the rest. But can the bank succeed in getting it against things like electrification or critical mineral supply chains? Can they bring it in? And I think this week we'll hear a bit more about that. I'm curious to hear more about the private sector lab and how it's working. Is it succeeding in some way? What is the bank hearing from private sector in terms of what the blockages are? I think we're going to be hearing more about the GEMS database, which assesses essentially the risk of lending in developing country markets and hopefully tries to reduce some of the perceived risk, which would theoretically allow more capital to flow at better interest rates to countries that are often in a real state of debt distress. So I think these are some of the things that we'll be certainly thinking about this week. Of course, we have Devex World. So, one of the things that's sort of missing in the conversation that we try to add by bringing Devex World to this week is the private sector voice. It is the philanthropy voice. We're going to have a lot of major philanthropies represented at Devex World. And there's a lot of interest at the bank in collaborating with those philanthropists. It seems to me, in some ways, as the bilateral aid market is shrinking, philanthropy is growing and maybe taking on some of the role that bilateral aid used to play. And so the MDBs and the bilateral and the philanthropies together are sort of ascendant. And I think we're going to get into a lot of that just across town at the Studio Theater for Devex World. Anything else the two of you are looking forward to for Devex World before we wrap up?
Well, I'll be diving into the US government side of things in particular. And there's a lot in the air about reforming the U.S. foreign aid system and how the U.S. government operates in the world of global development. So we'll hear from some well-known, long-standing voices on that topic, as well as some voices who could point us in the direction of either a Harris or a Trump administration and what the two, might do in that regard. But I think, sort of in keeping with the theme of the conversation that we've had this morning, it just seems like the sort of realm of possibilities has been opened a little bit when it comes to what might change. And so I'm excited to challenge some of those proposals with, a little dose of reality, but also to, really engage the possibilities that have been floated out there for some pretty radical reforms to the U.S. foreign aid system.
I'm definitely looking forward to hearing some of those conversations that Michael's going to moderate. My focus at Devex World is going to be sort of in the development finance realm, which is sort of my home at Devex, obviously. And so talking about really sort of what the multilateral development banks can be doing different on climate and development, and how they can continue to reform and evolve, looking specifically at energy and then African economic transformation, which I think will be a really good opportunity to continue a discussion we started actually at our event at UNGA, and are sort of continuing to see through.
Yeah, and I'm excited to be talking across a bunch of different themes. But one, apropos of what you just said, Michael, is with David Beasley, who was a Trump administration appointee in a sense to the World Food Program, and might play a role if the Trump administration comes back. And I'm interested to hear what he has to say. I've mentioned Axel von Trotzenberg talking about the World Bank evolution, and I'm going to get a rare interview with Howie Buffett, the noted philanthropist and farmer and photographer. And we're going to hear quite a bit about how he thinks about philanthropy, which I think is going to be really fascinating. So that's just a piece of what's going to be happening at Devex World. It's a really packed agenda in the middle of the World Bank and IMF annual meetings, I think for a great reason, because the private sector, the philanthropic voice, the NGO voice needs a place this week, and I think we're gonna bring that along with our broader coverage of these annual meetings. So I'm really excited to bring that to all of you who are listening in. Thank you everybody for joining us. See you, Michael, and see you, Adva, during our coverage next week. It's going to be a crazy and busy week, and we're going to be bringing it to all of you who are listening. This has been another episode of This Week in Global Development. Thanks for joining.
Thanks, Raj.
Thanks, Raj.